And welcome back to Casting Nets podcast from your hopefully radio or your phone or from your desktop, a computer. You are listening to us. We are from the distances of Maribel to Shirley to anywhere in between, which is there's not much in between. Denmark is in between, isn't there?
Denmark is there.
Denmark is there.
Kellnersville.
Kellnersville. That's south. That's south. We are coming to you from the office here now in Shirley. So I am a visitor here of Pastor Dave Ruddat, who is a co-host of Casting Nets podcast, and we are here today to share with you some words on alternative lifestyle. And if you are wondering what that all means, I'm not going to tell you until we get into the show. So knowing that we're going to talk about alternative lifestyle and knowing that we have been on the discussion of the book of Leviticus, we are going to be looking at Leviticus 11 through 16 and take it away for our disclaimer.
Well, just to let you know, dear listeners, that if you're saying alternative lifestyle, Pastor Harley and Pastor Ruddat talking about that's just wrong. Know that the word wrong is spelled wrong in the dictionary.
We really need a disclaimer.
The views and opinions of Pastor Harley and myself are just
right.
our opinion and our view. They are from the Bible, but some of the things we're talking about are may not be fully formulated in our own heads. We're just throwing stuff up against the wall. He and I both studied Leviticus 11 to 16, and now we're just sharing with you what we studied independently. And so it will be a discussion. So maybe our minds will be changed. So anything we say may be different by the time the podcast is over, by the time the discussion is over. So in that case, dear listener, if there's something that you are listening to and you are trying to figure out what are they talking about, or if something is offensive to you, please either reach out to us at castingnetspod@gmail.com or on Facebook, or you can talk to us in person, or you can listen to another podcast on the book of Leviticus or the other podcasts that we have. But in either case, dear listener, we are trying to start a conversation, not end a conversation. And so we encourage you to reach out to us.
So coming into our conversation here about Leviticus chapter 11 through 16, we are introduced to what I think a lot of people struggle with when it comes to the book of Leviticus. I mean, we've dealt with some of the sacramental law codes and things that were there for how you were to present and get things ready for the worship service. Now we're sort of moving into this idea of lifestyle. And what we have here in the book of Leviticus is, I think, something very, very beautiful in the sense that we have God in his holiness is bleeding out of the worship space into the lives of the nation. And so there's standards that are going to set them apart as people who are God's people. And I think that's probably the best overarching thing we can say about this chapter is, and as we go through, I mean, we can be talking about some of the pagan things that were going on in the area, and how the practices of the people of Israel will become fundamentally different because the Lord says don't do those things, and now they're set apart. Some of the ideas that were going around during that time of certain opinions about certain types of foods or certain types of actions, and how the Lord now sets them apart so that they are not relying on themselves. But I think essentially when you look at this set of chapters, you can get bogged down in the minutia, and you can start looking at all the different breaks and all the different things and the way it's set up and why this and not that. But really come down to the idea of this holiness and this being set apart as something special is bleeding out of the worship space into the homes and the lives of people, which makes it an alternative lifestyle to what was around them culturally in the world that they were living in.
I think when it comes to what is clean and unclean, the one thing that always permeates and maybe sticks around in my head the longest is just the fact that they couldn't eat bacon. I mean, just such a travesty. They couldn't eat bacon because
or ham.
Yeah.
I like ham. You know, they when they had their Christmas celebrations, they couldn't have a good ham, although Christmas wasn't really there. But if you think about it, I mean, you talk about some of those things, and I know that's it's not necessarily, well, it is in chapter 11. You talk about some of the animals they can't eat, and I know there's some thoughts that have been tossed around as to why God chose to do that, and I kind of I maybe it's just me personally. I think there is the religious aspect to it, of course. I think there's a little bit of Genesis wrapped up into here, but I also think that there is just the reality that if you look at the animals that God says it's okay to eat, by and large, even if you ate them somewhat raw, you're not going to get sick. It's not going to harm you. But you look at let's talk about pork, because we both love pork. We would be horrible Jews. If you don't cook it right, if you don't cook it all the way through, you know, you can get really sick. There is just some of these things that I think the Lord puts into here that they're like, you know, you have to be very, very careful of them. And because you're maybe not as careful because of the traditions of the world around you, these are things you should just avoid because they're going to make you unclean.
There are really 4 theories as to why the food is clean or unclean, why God chose what to eat. So we haven't actually talked about what makes an unclean other than pork. Just when it comes to the animals, the land animals, the 4-footed land animals, if it had a split hoof or chewed the cud, then it was okay. If not, then it was not. Then fish, if the fish had scales and fins, it was okay. Otherwise, not.
And if the bird, and when it came to birds, if they ate grain, seeds, they were okay. But if they ate of carcasses, they were not.
Right, and when it comes to insects that were
jointed above the knee,
those were okay.
So you can eat all of the crickets, and you can eat all of the grasshoppers with chocolate on them that you desire, but you can't eat spiders.
Yeah, as if that's a thing, right? And none of the
have you
no lizards either. No lizards.
No
snakes.
Yeah, you can't have lizards, snakes, and if you ever watch those shows, you know, where you're out in the middle of the sticks everywhere, they're killing snakes all the time and peeling them and eating them, and they're eating, you know, spiders all the time, and these are big no-nos for the people of Israel. And I think we should talk a little bit about it. And
I haven't talked about my 4 theories.
Well, I'm talk about your 4 theories, and then we'll let you. It's your house. Do what you want.
The 4 theories. One is what the thing that you were talking about. Perhaps it's a health reason where if you can imagine if you're eating an animal such as a vulture that is eating dead things to live, perhaps the transmission of diseases could be passed on that way. When it comes to like rats and mice, you want to keep those things out of your house because those things transmit disease, even though back then they didn't know that rats and mice can transmit disease. And even with the Black Plague in Europe, they didn't know that the rats transmitted diseases. So in this way, you could say a health reason that the Israelites may not have been aware of. Perhaps that is the reason. That's number one. Another reason might be the cultish association with some of these animals of the nations around them. That the Egyptians, for example, I forget which one of the animals that the Egyptians worshipped and ate as part of their worship practices. So that's reason number 2. Reason number 3 might be symbolic. Think of the pig wallowing in mud. Might be the idea of some of these animals are some of the things that they do are associated with sin. I think that's the weakest one of the 4. And then the 4th would be just any of the animals that were considered odd. Like you have animals that aren't quite the same as all the other animals, all quite the same.
One of these things is not like the other.
Yeah. But that one's also a weak one because they're all created by God. So how can God create something that is odd?
And I think we have to take into consideration that that the scriptures do not contradict themselves. And so if we go into the New Testament and we look at Peter seeing the great net filled with all of the animals, and the Lord says, "Everything that I have created, nothing that I have created is unclean." And we look at that and we say, "See, God's giving us the okay to eat all of these things." I don't. You can't look at that and say, "Oh, God changed His mind," so I don't think that's the. I don't think that's the idea. I think what we have here in the idea, and I think we can take some of those 4 things, we can blend them all together and put them on the mixer and say, I think there's a little bit of everything coming out of this mix.
Yeah, I would agree.
Because I think you have a society in which these people are found, where the religious practices of the society, especially when it came to eating and the use of these certain animals, where they were being misused. And so you had made mention of the people of Egypt where they ate certain lizards as part of a religious practice to commune with their gods. But you have other things that were done too. You had like the fortune tellers who would take lizards or take the entrails of certain animals, and they would try to discover what these were. You had a culture that was very animalistic in the sense of if you ate certain animals who were strong or viewed to be predators within the world, if you ate their heart, if you ate their liver, you would gain their strength. And I think there's some maybe not just some, a lot of the crossover where the Lord says, I'm going to make you separate from those people. You're not even going to touch those animals and even get into that conversation of the possibility of being connected with that type of thought. And we're going to see this play out later on too, when we get into further chapters and some other diseases and some other lifestyle things that the Lord is going to say, no, we're separating you. So I think there's some of that in there. But I think coming back also to Genesis, and we'd both sort of started talking that a little bit. When God created animals, He created these divisions: wild animals, domestic animals, creepy things, slithering things. And it's like in the very beginning, God intended, right, for certain animals to be animals used for domestic purpose and other animals to not be in that purview. So we have this in the very beginning, the Lord already creating these standards of certain animals are okay for you to eat and engage with outside of health risks that are present. And I'm not saying that, again, we can come back to pork, but let's not even go let's just go to other animals. Like go back to the fish conversation. More people die from eating shark than being eaten by shark because it takes a very special to prepare shark, right? Otherwise you can get sick or things. So I think there's this level of care God is giving to His people, and he's saying, you need to watch out and be careful because you think you're wise, but you're not. And you think you know what you're doing, but you don't. And I keep coming back and playing in my mind the difference of Meshach, Shadrach, Abednego, and Daniel in Babylon, and all of these people, all the rest of the Jewish people that were taken as prisoners are eating all this fine food from the table of the Babylonians, and he says, I can't eat that, and so they're going to limit their diet, restrict their diet, and at the end they're healthier because of it. And I'm saying maybe some of the stuff we try to put into our bodies isn't always the best stuff to put into our bodies.
I like how you're saying how this demonstrates a level of care, because we have to be very careful not to say, well, this is this alternate lifestyle of living in the Old Testament is the ultimate lifestyle. This is the way that we should live. I think I don't think you're going that far, but just demonstrating to God's people in the Old Testament that God is demonstrating a level of care, but most importantly, He is putting a hedge around them. He is saying, you guys are my people, and I'm going to make you different from the nations around you, and this is one way. And in that hedge around God's people, He's reminding them just how much they need Him because of all of this uncleanliness that can happen. I mean, we talked about this in Bible class, and they said, what about mosquitoes? What if you hit a fly or a mosquito and it lands on your table? That table instantly becomes unclean, and you have to take the special water of purification and wash the table. Or if it hits your sheets, so you have this constant reminder that God, you need Him, and that you are unclean, that the effects of sin that happened in the garden have permeated your day-to-day life. But
I also think we need to come in and say, and just hedge that just in a section to say, being considered unclean was not considered unholy.
Yeah, exactly.
So you were still God's holy people. You were just now in this, brought to the reality of, if you continue down this path, you're going to be heading in the wrong direction. We had that discussion when we first started Leviticus, that there is the difference between what is common and ordinary and what was used then as holy things. And then there's a conversation between what is considered clean and common and unclean and common. And because you're unclean and maybe common does not mean that you are unholy. It just means that now something, you are coming back to be fed by the Lord. You're coming back to be brought into His presence again, and God again is acting on your behalf.
Yeah, thanks for the correction. It's not necessarily that they were sinning, but they were heading in that direction. Yeah,
right. And I think that comes into play here because chapter 11 really deals with something that I think is most profound, and I've made this connection with the Lord's Supper as well, and I think it's a beautiful connection, and that is, you have the clean animals, the animals that they are able to eat are animals that are also able to be used for sacrifice. Those are the animals God chose for that sacramental exchange, that when they come to the Lord's table and they eat of those things from the Lord's table, the Lord is now saying they're good enough for me, they're good enough for your family. And I thought that was kind of a neat thing, that from the Lord's table, it bleeds into the home table. And I've used that in connection with the Lord's Supper, that the forgiveness that we receive from the Lord's table, from His hand and His body and blood and bread and wine, bleeds into the forgiveness we share around our family table because of what the Lord has given to us. And I think you have that beautiful image in at least chapter 11, right, of this is the kind of thing that the Lord accepts. This is the kind of thing that the Lord desires, and He gives to you in sacramental union from in His worship. It's good enough for your home. Now that being said, I think we've lost that in our society today, and you have this difference that the Lord says. He goes, "You are a holy people. You are set apart. So you're not supposed to be doing the exact same thing as everyone else around you." And if you look at our society today, you look at even Christians today, we come, we worship, we go home, and we live like everybody else. We engage with everything that every people do. I'm not saying all the people do it all the time, but there's that tendency, right? That when someone looks at us, sometimes it's really hard to tell the difference between the Christian and the non, right? And God is saying, no, as a Christian, this is the divinely inspired alternative lifestyle. And it's not the way you think. It's not indulging in my sinful nature, but it's an engaging with the gifts that God has given in the preservation of setting us apart.
Yeah, and Jesus talks about that too, or turning the other cheek. If somebody demands something from you, give them more than what they ask for. All of these things that indicate to God, to the people around you, that God's way is different, that there's something different about you, dear Christian, and it's not the way that you dress, and it's not the food that you eat, it's how you conduct yourself that sets you apart, and it serves as a witness to those around you.
So I'm going to just give a life example here for my own life. My wife has had a friend. They don't talk as much as they used to anymore. Who married a gentleman who was from a different church body organization, we'll say, and in their church body organization, they downplayed very highly the drinking of any alcohol as being horribly bad. You couldn't touch it, you couldn't be around it, and we would go out to eat with them, and I would purposely have a beer while I sat with them. And I know all of you listening now are like, "Oh, Pastor, why would you do that?" Because I was showing.
If people knew you, they would be like, "Yeah, that's
just
exactly
one?
what Pastor Harley." That's exactly what he would do.
But I would purposely have a beer, and it would always spur this conversation of, how can you do that as a Christian? How could you be drinking? And I said, because in the freedom of the gospel, I can do this. Now, what sets me apart is not that I had a beer. What sets me apart is I didn't have to have 2 or 3 or 4. It wasn't the fact that I engaged in this, and it wasn't in fact that I wasn't going to that extreme. See, that's this part where as Christians, in the society in which we live, if God does not mandate against it and someone does, we in Christian freedom stand up and say, no, I'm going to push against that. On the opposite side, just because the society says you can go and let loose and put your hair down and engage in this and heavily engage in this, as Christians, we would say, no, we're going to temper that, and we're going to step back from that, right? And we're going to not engage so fully, because there's a difference between what we're supposed to be. And I think that especially in these eating codes, you have this going on where the Lord is forcing them to look at the societies around them, forcing them to look at what's going on, and He's saying this is a way that people are going to see you are different, and you're resting on me, and you're relying on me instead of relying on everyone else to tell you what is good or bad. And He says, I'm telling you what is good, and I'm giving it to you. That's my thought on 11.
That's on 11. Yeah. Speaking of alternative lifestyle, giving birth in the Old Testament.
So is the alternative lifestyle the fact that they are giving birth as opposed to the majority of people today not giving birth?
I'm trying to make a connection, and it's not quite getting there. So anyway,
they didn't give birth like we give birth.
No, I'm trying to make the connection. I'm just trying to follow the theme of the podcast for today, and I struggled.
There's nothing to struggle about other than the fact that,
what's alternative about giving birth is my question. That's why I brought it up.
Well, it is alternative what's giving birth, because if you think about it, and this is amazing discussion, because many of the cultures in which they were found, the sexual practices were deemed as power plays. And birth of children were deemed as services to gods, where if and we see this later on in some of the practices of Baal worship and Ashtoreth worship in the Jewish communities as it infested from the Canaanite communities, where they were called sympathetic religion, where if you would go and you would see the priests and the priestesses of those two gods, the idea was you slept with them, and that would produce, if that union produced a child, then the gods in heaven responded, and you would have better crops. And so this whole idea of looking at birth and looking at the blessing of birth, and yet also the reality of what it brings, is a very important thing. Even today, that the Jewish community tracks the menstrual cycles of their women. They track the fertility of their women very, very closely, because they value what this is so highly because of what the Lord has placed on it.
Okay, I see that. One of the sources I was looking at chapter 12 just talked about why were they in seclusion for so long after they gave birth, and one of the theories was to celebrate the fact that she had a child, and to give her that time to bond with that child. yes, it's different for men and women because the men, the little boys were circumcised after 7 days, so she was only unclean for 7 days rather than 14 days. But still, that whole idea of seclusion, not being out in public so that she would enjoy this wonderful gift that God had given her rather than this being a means to an end, like you said, a power play or as a demonstration of God's favor.
Well, they also
on your crops, which has nothing to do with the child that's being born.
And I'm not exactly sure as to the validity of this or not, but they were saying that I was reading a commentary that had made mention that it also could have been, again, because of the blood aspect of this, in the society and in the culture around them, post-birth blood was considered to carry life force and considered to carry connections to the world beyond and life beyond. And so the Lord secludes them from a society so that there's no doubt that, you can't indulge in this kind of behavior. You can't indulge in this type of witchcraftery. They also were saying that the lengths of time were different because for a woman, depending on if you have a male baby or a female baby, and again, I'm not a scientist or a doctor in any way, but they were saying in the commentary I was reading that it is hormonally different, and the hormones in the mother are adjusted depending on what sex of the baby is, and that it exits the system faster for the testosterone of having a male exit your system faster for a woman than if you had a female and you have estrogen that was built up and was in your system, and that the results physically lasted longer having a daughter than it did having a son. I don't know if that's true or not, but realize that, notice for both, they have 8 days and they're back in worship.
14 days for the girls.
14 days for the girl, but it's not as if they're secluded from worship. It's they're secluded from the other people. And so I like that idea that you had said, they get to focus on being a parent and the gift that God has given to them. And I think of Hannah, right? She took 7 years and she says, let me do this. And she was just so overjoyed with the gift of having a child. And I think that's what makes it an alternative to what we have today, because I've been listening to the news and podcasts and so many parents are, there was just a podcast that I was listening to that on the news, they were saying that there was one parent who has gone on to be a viral whatever through YouTube or Twitter, whatever. And
Face Twitter. I like
Face
it.
Twitter. But she had said how she hates being a parent and that her children have just destroyed her life. And what we see here in this, it seems like it's a law and do this. But what it is, it's a time for the parents to love being parent. And that is an alternative to what we have in society, where we have people who are so self-absorbed. They're just so that is what the norm is today. The vast majority of people are so self-absorbed that children are just to stroke their ego, and then when they have lived out their usefulness, we want to write them off. And yet the Lord says, no, you can't. And there are going to be rules and regulations that are going to build this connection between you and your child. I like the way you were thinking.
All right. This isn't just picking on the women and their menstrual cycles and giving birth. In chapter 15, you also have the male aspect of it too. So all the discharges that come out of the male, whether it be something from gonorrhea or whether it be nocturnal emissions from the guy, would make them unclean. So it's back, both of them. Anything coming out of them is makes them unclean, and they need to be clean because of it. Yeah,
and I know we're skipping ahead, and we'll come back and do the skin diseases. But when you talk about chapter 15, really what you're dealing with there is not just the nocturnal things, the things that maybe you don't have any control over, because those are your subconscious sinful nature, acting. But you also have the regulations of against the misuse of the gift of sex that God has given to a married couple, and saying that when you misuse sex and you misuse that union, and you abuse that you are you're on the way of leading yourself further and further and further from the Lord and His table. And again, it comes back down to lifestyle, right? And the scriptures are heavily comment on sexual practice in the scriptures because it is a huge part of life. And I think it's one of the vices that more and more people fall into than almost anything else, is the vices of sexual appetites.
Yep, I would agree. One of the neat things that I liked about chapter 15 is Mark chapter 5, when the woman who had the problem with bleeding comes up to Jesus in the middle of the crowd, and chapter 15 reminded me just what she was doing. She was potentially infecting an entire crowd of people, making them all unclean. She didn't want to bring it up before Jesus, because if she brought it up, then people around her would say, well, why are you out in the midst of us if you are unclean? Now you've made all of us unclean. Where she did all of this subversive, like, if I just touch his cloak, I will be clean. And how Jesus, and I think I'm glad that you reminded me of this earlier, is the fact that Jesus himself then became unclean. In Mark chapter 1, Jesus touches the lepers and makes them clean. So he himself becomes unclean, needs to be clean. So being unclean isn't the same as sinning, but just this whole idea of what she was going to bring to that crowd, and her desire to just be in his presence, just to hold on to him just for a little bit, and with that faith that she had, and then Jesus, of course, responding and saying, who touched me, and bringing this all out into the open so that he could accentuate her faith and how awesome her faith was, that she was believing in Jesus, looking to Jesus, and that's just the struggle that she had of, I've got nowhere to go except for to Jesus, and I'm going to do all these things that people aren't going to like me for, but I'm going to hold on to Jesus. He's the only way that I can be rescued from this situation.
Well, and I think, bringing Jesus into this is really the focus and point of all of it. And the reality is just as God pronounces clean, right? God is the one who ultimately makes us clean and holy in his presence. You see Jesus do that instantly. Whereas in the Levitical laws, he's given a lot of this over to the priests. They can only do so much, and they're really not doing anything to fix the problem. They're recognizing, has the problem been fixed by God or not? And you have that in the New Testament, like with the healing of the lepers. Maybe this is going back to chapter 13 in Leviticus, but you have the healing of the lepers, right? And what did Jesus do? Jesus, after he heals them, sends them to go and show themselves that they are healed. The priests don't do anything. It's not as if the priests have the magic touch and they heal anybody, but they are the ones that the Lord has given the command to, or the response, let's just say responsibility, not command. They have given the responsibility to them to pronounce for the community, this problem has been taken care of. And I think there is such a beautiful connection between that and what the job of the pastor is today. The pastor's job is not to be the one who says, because I forgave you, you're forgiven. No, Christ does the forgiveness. Christ does the changing of the heart. The Spirit is the one that works faith. What is the responsibility of a pastor, right? I can assure you of that. And when I'm sitting in a council and someone says, well, so-and-so was having a problem, and they came to visit with me privately, and I can say to them, they're forgiven. This conversation has been had. The Lord has done what he has promised to do, and they're forgiven. I can to the rest of the people, it is our responsibility to say, we can pronounce what God has done. And it's awesome. I find that to be just an amazing thing, that the Lord takes sinful people and says, you can work with me in pronouncing what I have done. Did it change anything? Did the Lord still heal her? Yep. Is she now left without that problem? Yep. But then the Lord gives to his people the opportunity to pronounce it and to then engage and live with it, right? And that is a neat result. And I think he does this in Leviticus too. He gives the priests the opportunity to pronounce this so that people are gaining the benefit.
Let's go into leprosy. And did you know that Kevin Bacon has leprosy? The doctor said he has a foot loose.
Oh, jeez.
I have other leprosy jokes, but they all fall apart at the end.
All right. Well, then.
Chapter 13.
Welcome to chapter 13.
So
I'm the sarcastic one, and he's the one that thinks he's funny.
That's a trait we both share.
That we think we're funny.
So leprosy could be more than just Hansen's disease. Could be things caused by a fungal infection, like flavus, or also called favid. It could be a pigmentation problem with your autoimmune system, such as vitiligo, or it could be something that my dad had, which was I can't even say it. I can't say it. psoriasis. It's a skin infection that you have. Your skin turns red, and then sometimes there's like the little white spots on the top of it.
Sure.
So my dad had that. I have that on my elbows, but anyway. So leprosy, whatever kind of skin disease, this chapter isn't just about leprosy itself, but just skin ailments that can make somebody unclean.
Well, and I think leprosy becomes almost the catch-all for the majority of skin diseases. We would say that leprosy in itself, the disease of leprosy, is a bacterial issue that eats the flesh away, and it usually goes on the appendages that are extremities that are small, your fingers, your ears, your nose, that kind of stuff, your toes. Eventually might get your foot. But
it might get loose.
It might get loose. And leprosy, that type of leprosy, the bacterial side, is still here today. There are places where it is, and they can, if they catch it early enough, they can beat it. But I mean, they used to have colonies set up where people would have these afflictions. But I think that we should take a step back and just realize that in Leviticus, what we're dealing with are skin diseases that are not like normal acne. These are skin diseases that are changing the barrier, the guard, the protection that God has given to us naturally on our skin. And one of the things that I think is interesting about it is how often the skin disease becomes the reflection of what sin does to us in general. And I think there's this highlight of not only on how infectious they can be and spreading to other people, but also just the idea of there's this visible reaction when you see somebody with a skin disease and say, wow, they don't look good. And I think you have here this visible representation of, wow, none of us really look good. I mean, we are sinners. And when you get into the New Testament, you see a lot of that the treatment of lepers is really treated as they are such horrible sinners because it's bleeding out of them.
They were the zombies.
They were, yeah. When really the Lord is like, no, that's all of you. This is just a disease that says you're in a sinful world. Again, though, I think this is the Lord saying from his sanctuary as he goes out, his holiness as it goes out into the community, impacts lifestyle, and his care is for them. He's not saying ignore them. He's not saying throw them away. He's not, you know what I'm saying? He is saying you need to take care because this could spread. This is not good for the community, but we don't throw away the person, which I think ended up happening more often than not, that the community threw away the person and was a direct affront to what God's intention is, where that the person would be healed and then brought back into the community.
And it was a long process to be brought back in, which I think highlights, my opinion, highlights just the care that God has put into God's people. Don't rush to bring this back in, because this could spread to the rest of the community and infect the entire community, but also the idea, the hope that they could come back. And there would be various sacrifices that were done to demonstrate that they are now clean, and to announce to everybody else, hey, these people can come back into the community. The priest would say something to that effect to make sure that God's people could welcome this individual back in, because people are going to be like people have been with the pandemic. Oh, you're not wearing a mask. Stay away from me. That kind of thing. Where you're cured of leprosy. Stay away from me, just that kind of thing.
And I guess I'm going to ask you this, and I don't know, but I was just thinking as you're talking about that, and you brought up the pandemic and how many people have stopped coming to worship. And you think about these skin diseases and the length of time that these skin diseases hung around. And I just was thinking about this, you said, well, it's a long process for them to come back. Was it really a long process for them to come back, or was this the Lord is reestablishing that sacramental connection? They had been away from the gifts of the altar so long that now God goes through all of these steps to reconnect them to his grace. And so you have the sin offerings, you have the pure, they haven't been able to participate in them. So now we're going to go through and we're going to do all of this.
It was a long process because it was more than a week, because they had to be outside of the camp, and then they had to shave, and then they had to wash, and then they had to spend time outside of the camp, and then they come back and they shave and wash again. So it's all
right.
It's a longer process that throughout the whole thing, the priest has to make sure that the skin disease is actually gone. Other sacrifices and things of that nature were done before that individual was welcomed back into the community.
Right, but what I'm saying is that, is it really that? Now, I'm not saying we're dealing with skin disease, but in the spiritual realm, is it that odd for that to happen, in the sense of, let's say we have a member who has allowed their normal regular worship attendance to lax extremely, and when they start coming back, I've known pastors, myself included, to say, I really highly recommend we maybe sit down and just refresh ourselves on the promises of the Lord. Not maybe saying go through a big class again, but maybe refresh ourselves. Can I meet with you so that we understand the gifts that what we are receiving, and we understand the importance of why we're doing this? Because you've been away from it for so long, that this is a joyful thing that we can remind ourselves. Is some of that kind of in there? Maybe. If you have these people who have been out for weeks or even years because of a skin disease, and then they come back, it's there's a reestablishing of these promises.
You, of course, are free to do what you would like as pastor of your congregation.
Absolutely.
And the people that you have. But as a pastor myself, if I see somebody that hasn't been in worship in a long time because of the pandemic, I'd be more inclined to just encourage and say, it's great to have you. I'm glad you're back. I've had members who I haven't seen in a long time, and one of the steps that they take to come back to worship is to worship in their cars. So they're sitting out there worshiping in their cars, some of them even wearing the mask in their cars, which some might say, well, that's pretty silly to do that because it's just you inside the car. But for me, I don't mention anything about that. I'm just saying, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're here to worship God. I'm glad that you're here to, and let the gospel do the rest. And then eventually those folks are coming back inside as well. Some of them just like being outside, and some of them have actually taken it to be their calling to be out there so that they can encourage the other people that are coming in their car to come back to worship.
Well, and I'm not denying that I'm not saying I'm not glad to see someone come back. I truly am. Well, I guess I'm painting the picture that when we remove ourselves from the word of the Lord for an extended period of time, there is a lot that we move away from our understanding of who he is and what he has done. And however that happens, either through constant worship and you're coming back and you're reminded through word and sacrament over and over and over again, or whether it is, Pastor, I would really enjoy having a sit down with you and being reminded of those things. It's not unusual to have these things given. And I think you have some of that built into this with these people who have skin diseases. You have the thoroughness of making sure that we're not introducing something into the community, but we're having we're having a Lord who is showing meticulous care for that individual. And I think you can't circumvent that, because otherwise Leviticus becomes a book of laws instead of a book of gospel of God preserving his people throughout the sinful world. And I really, every time when I've approached the book of Leviticus when I was younger, and I've heard about it when I was younger, it's always, that's a book of laws. Law this, law that, law this. And it's like, yes, you can so easily get lost in thinking that this is God telling us to do certain things and then he will react. But that's not what it is. We have God who says, you are holy. You are my people. I have already claimed you. And I am going to do everything to keep this relationship and to reestablish these relationships and to preserve you throughout these relationships. And when you fall, because sin is in the world, not necessarily because you are a sinner, but because sin is in the world, when you fall, I'm going to reestablish this relationship with you, because that is my promise. I will be your God and you will be my people. I just... It's really easy to start getting into the habit of saying, well, they have to follow these rules. Well, why are they following them? They're following them because God is reestablishing his promise for them, right? And God is taking these mundane, ordinary things and doing extraordinary things through them. Baptism, communion, the preaching of the word, the sinner who gets to preach it. Or the friend who brings Jesus before their ears. God's using you to reestablish those lines of communication in that relationship. That's my that's all I wanted to say. I'm not saying that you're wrong in any of what you're saying or how to approach it. I'm just, you look at the beauty and the care he's taking.
I think it's a good way to wrap up the show for today. I think we'll look at the Day of Atonement in a show in and of itself, since that's really at the highlight of the book of the Torah, the 5 books of the Bible of Moses. And as we say, this is an alternative lifestyle that God put on God's people, not because he wants to burden them with something, but that he wants to show extreme care for them and to preserve the line of the Savior until the Savior is born, and for us to understand just how much we need our God in our everyday life.